Hello, everyone. Welcome here today. My name is Steve Spellman. I have the privilege to be the president of the council. This month, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary of our first event, which was a lunch at the Hotel Worthy here in Springfield with the presidents of Smith College and Mount Holyoke College. And that luncheon in 1926 featured a debate on the rise of fascism in Italy. We are putting together a program to celebrate our 100th anniversary, and there'll be more coming about that. As always, I want to thank our sponsors, Wilbraham and Munson Academy and Sir Speedy. We'd also like to thank our new media sponsor, the Republican newspaper. And as always, special thanks to NAI Plotkin for this wonderful meeting area. I want to thank Steve, George, and Josue from Focus Springfield, who are videotaping and recording our session today. Membership. If you are not a member, please join. It's a great council. If you are a member and you need to renew, please renew and either join or renew as generously as you can. We have several layers or levels, and in these tough times, every little bit helps. We have sign-up sheets over here. Sid is holding up. We are currently working to schedule several events for spring and fall, including more adventures in international dining. We had a great one the other day, Fatuma Cafe up on Dickinson Street in Springfield. And I brought some stuff home the other day for my lovely bride, Liz, and she was raving about it too. On February 25th, we will again partner with the Jewish Community Center in presenting what is known as Pros and Cons, a nonfiction book discussion group at 3 p.m. at the JCC, February 25th at 3. Our executive director, Sid Melcher, will be one of the presenters. What happens is various people read books and then present on them, and then there will be questions and discussion. This is the brainchild of Buncey Churchill, right here, and she is the former president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. If you would like more information about this, please speak with Buncey or with Sid. We are delighted to welcome Olin Bielski and others from the Polish Center in Chicopee who are displaying in the back there. Thank you, gentlemen. Neighbors in Unity, a visual journey through the Ukrainian war. The photographs are from a traveling exhibition which has been all over. It's been at Harvard, it's been at other places, commemorating the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can view the photos and hear more about it by speaking with them. Fabulous, fabulous photos. Regarding all our speaker events, the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts is a nonpartisan educational organization dedicated to fostering civil discourse on international events and foreign policy. Our speakers' opinions are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the council or our affiliates. Today, our speaker is Dr. Joshua Spero, PhD. He is a special assistant to the president and professor of political science and international relations at Fitchburg State University. He was recommended to us by one of our newest board members, Ryan McNutt. He focuses on international security, particularly European and Eurasian security and government decision-making. Before becoming an academic, he served as a senior civilian strategic planner for the Department of Defense on the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate in the Europe-NATO Division. He was also a national security analyst at the Institute for National Strategic Studies and a deputy assistant for Europe and the USSR at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He also served on the U.S. Army's Fort Leavenworth, Kansas-based Soviet Army Foreign Military Studies Office liaison, and he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Atlantic Council. On March 12, 2003, the 4th anniversary of NATO membership for the Republic of Poland, Dr. Spero received the Knight Cross of the Order of Merit from the President of Poland. Today, he will be speaking to us on how Poland and Ukraine anchor Europe's defense. He'll speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have some questions. We've got one microphone that's working today, so what I'm going to ask you to do is say your question loudly. He will repeat it, and then everybody will hear it, and then we'll answer it. As always, as I like to say, great questions start with the words who, what, when, where, how, why, explain, describe, and rarely start with the word I. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Spero.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction, and it's an honor to join you for this wonderful event. It's a pleasure to have received this invitation. Thank you to the leadership here. As I've gotten to know Sid by email and phone, I greatly appreciate all the logistics that goes into putting these together. This is an exciting opportunity to discuss a very challenging and difficult situation. But I do want to at least give you some, shall we say, lighter introductory words before I get into the presentation on the screen. One of which is that Sid and I go way back because as we learned when she first reached out after Ryan McNutt, who you've just heard, gave me this opportunity, we realized that we had Fitchburg State connections. I arrived a couple years after Sid had transformed the college. So it's nice to have those links, especially in the state university system. I guess it really was destiny that brought me here for several reasons today, and I want to commend one of your new board, members, Ryan McNutt, who you've just heard about briefly. Ryan, he couldn't join us as he's on another adventure in his wonderful leadership career in public service like myself, but I wanted to just let you know that I first met Ryan in 2003, just after he had returned from the initial wave of war in Iraq. And so he was a fairly young veteran, and he took my class. He was one of the first students I taught when I got to Fitchburg State. He's become, after nearly a quarter century, not only a good colleague, but a good friend. And so his understanding of world events and strategy, I truly hope can contribute greatly to this wonderful World Affairs Council of Western Mass. Should put some more, shall we say, interesting items onto the screen. As I join you in a region of Massachusetts, which, as you all well know, is a bastion of Polish and Ukrainian culture, heritage, tradition. I should say without any bias that I have Polish and Ukrainian blood among 9 bloods in Central and Southeastern Europe. So a lot of this really is a heartland journey for me. Some of the issues I'm going to address today actually span back to the last time I was at and in front of a wonderful World Affairs Council audience, which was the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. And I heard Philly mentioned today. So I was west of there in 1993, where we were talking about the emerging post-USSR, and of course discussing Ukrainians as well as, shall we say, the post-Soviet impact of the Warsaw Pact in Central East Europe, and the Poles at that point had already moved rapidly toward a fast reintegration into Europe. One of the people who I joined on that panel, so I'm just going to put up a little bit more here, who joined me on that panel was a young research assistant named Paige Sullivan, who actually was researching with this gentleman, Zbigniew Brzezinski, on his, at that time, latest and greatest of many, many publications. So it just was ironic that at the World Affairs Council in Pittsburgh and now the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, there's these bookends of a career where I've spent nearly 40 years in public service, whether in government service, which we can talk about certainly in the Q&A, but a lot of my presentation will hearken to the 1980s and 90s, as well as to the present, and then, of course, academia. And for someone who's just 45 years old, I've spent a lot of time in public service. I wish I was 45, but time is moving on. I'm just trying to disguise that as well as I can. You see on the screen, and if anyone can't read the text, most of the text will be larger than what you see on the screen. I'll reference it without just simply reading it. But you see the name Mackinder. And Mackinder talks a lot, as I now move more toward this Polish-Ukrainian anchor focus of this slide. There's going to be just one slide on the screen, and I'm going to bring different pieces of it together. I've found over a quarter century in teaching that students at least can pay attention more to one slide rather than in my days of working with the U.S. military, where we would have 100 slides in a presentation, since the Department of Defense created PowerPoint, basically, and the world has not been the same for that. Mackinder talks about the heartland theory, or the geopolitical pivot in history, and the heartland being what you see here in the screen in Central East Europe to the west, north, east, and south. That heartland, those powers that control that region control the world, according to Halford Mackinder's thesis, which goes back to the turn of the previous century, 1904, 1905. When I not only was a student, even in the early to mid 80s, when I was starting to get really familiar with why I wanted to become a Soviet specialist, I certainly read Brzezinski, and then to be able to work with him in his later years, not only in the 1990s, but even into the current century, and especially to work with both of his sons. You might know Mark recently was the U.S. ambassador to Poland, Mark Brzezinski, in the last administration. Brzezinski always pointed out that without controlling the territory that we call Ukraine today, Russia would never be an empire. And that builds on Mackinder's theory. Now, these are two very dominant forces in international relations, Mackinder and Brzezinski, and have affected many around the world, certainly Poles and Ukrainians. But there are a lot of disputes and a lot of debates over these types of approaches, but power does define many things. So I want to talk about how the Poland and Ukraine anchor truly defines Europe's defense. And I'm going to focus not only historically, but also over the last year, especially as we head toward February 24th, which is the 4-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion by Russia against Ukraine. But also since January 20th, 2025, which, as you understand, was the change in administrations in the United States. So one of the things that I do want to focus on are what I think are the geopolitical or geostrategic factors in this heartland essence for how the Polish-Ukrainian relationship militarily and, of course, related to foreign policy developed over the last 3 decades, especially in the post-communist or post-Soviet world. So we get to the point where the Poles, one of their priorities, as you're probably aware, is that they want to ensure that U.S. military forces remain deployed on Polish territory. There are about 10,000 of those forces in Poland since the weeks before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that is certainly transforming what we witness as European security. When you look at Poland, as you well know, you see just how many borders define its central location. Germany to the west, Czechia and Slovakia to the south, Ukraine, of course, Belarus to the east, and then you have Lithuania and this sliver of territory currently referred to as Kaliningrad, which is Russia, and Russia is actually cut off from greater Russia because of the Belarus, Polish, Lithuanian, shall we say, area that isolates this enclave. So this is not only a pressure cooker, but certainly a tripwire historically and today. Poland has become a major player in European security over the last 30 years, as now have the Ukrainians, not because the Ukrainians would have wanted to take the path that they have of having to fight for now 11 years, which I'll get into in a moment, against Russia, but because they too wanted to reintegrate into Europe. While this has certainly pushed the Poles and Warsaw and Poland to expand militarily and quite significantly. So they're anticipating having a doubling of their military in the next couple of years to about 500,000 forces. And they're currently the 3rd largest military in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or as you see here, NATO, and the EU, of course, is the European Union. I'm going to be focusing mostly on Poland, Ukraine, and NATO, as opposed to economic, financial types of security challenges that often get associated with the European Union. 3rd largest behind the United States and Turkey. So already that's quite significant when you consider that Poland has been trying to gain the attention of the bigger players in Europe as well as the world for some time, and yet, just to take a brief side note, you may have also heard that within the last couple of months, Poland has become the 20th most significant economy in the world, top 20, which is quite impressive. When one looks at European security, the issue always of deterrence and deterring war, at least on a larger scale, with the use of nuclear weapons. And so a nuclear umbrella is now an issue that is getting discussed a lot more, especially since nuclear arms control agreements have basically deteriorated between the United States and Russia, at least the remaining ones. But when Europeans, especially Central and East Europeans, those who are located here, as I use this electronic pointer, some of whom are in NATO, some of whom are in NATO and the European Union as members, some of whom are not. How might Europeans defend themselves should the United States no longer provide a nuclear deterrent? These are questions that if you're a strategist or a scholar or both who think about these issues, and some of you have experience in this realm, you ask yourself, could this be possible where Great Britain, the UK, and France, who do have nuclear weapons, were to become the new nuclear umbrella for the rest of the NATO members, which total into some 30 countries, especially if the United States does intend to reduce not only its forces, but perhaps its nuclear umbrella over Europe, which it's had basically since the post-World War II era unfolded and NATO emerged in the late 40s, early 1950s. One has to think this way, although I have to say when I was coming out here today, I heard that the third highest official in the Pentagon, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, an office I used to work in the late 1980s, declared in Brussels, Belgium, at NATO headquarters at a NATO defense ministers meeting that the United States would not withdraw from Europe, which is important to reiterate, and that he was glad and welcomed more NATO members increasing their defense budgets. But we do need to keep these things in mind. And so let me turn to how do we get to this upper right box where these major types of questions, or at least considerations and issues, get raised for us to consider. So I'm going to continue to fill in the blank spaces as I tell my students over the years and walk you through quickly some of that history. Poland and Ukraine as a defensive anchor, and the European pillar. This is not an issue or a topic that very many people identify these days. I don't know if they probably never really have. It's always been the British, the French, the Germans to a certain extent, and of course the Americans when it comes to military and defense issues in Europe. But yet the worst fighting and the highest amount of killing since World War II has been occurring on Ukraine's territory. And so that is front and center what's defining European security. And Poland and Ukraine are at the heart of that definition of European security. And yet, we also are starting to see the Germans reawaken in terms of their defense and their military. And they have I would estimate, quite a few years to go to build back, but they understand just how significant this war fighting has unfolded, especially since 2022 in February. So if we look at how Europe has stabilized itself in that post-World War II era up to the present, two key facets emerge so that we can look at what one might define or one might characterize as reconciliations. So you have the post-World War II Franco-German or French-German reconciliation as the 1950s, 60s, and 70s emerge. And that is still very significant and a powerful force for stabilizing international institutions like NATO and the European Union. But you also have over here the post-Cold War Polish-German reconciliation. And that really took place in the years of the first post-communist government from 1989 to 1993 in Poland, which was crucial and is often overlooked, not by this audience, but by many around the world. And that reconciliation still remains strong, but this is not to say that reconciliations reduce entirely problems. It's about how you can communicate, especially in crisis, and the partnerships and cooperation that you've developed. And then we'll have the Ukrainians. And I'm connecting these three colored rings because they connect militarily as well as in other ways. But when you look at the Polish-Ukrainian partnership, if not, as I would argue, more of recognizing its emergence over the last 35 years, in many ways as a bridge to Europe, in the European heartland. So when you look at recognitions with Poland and Ukraine, that's, of course, their abbreviations. You go back to 1991 and the USSR's disintegration, and Poland is the first country to recognize a newly re-independent, if you will, Ukraine. First country in the world, which is a really important juncture. I've put several other timeframes here, some of which I've already referred, but 1994 is not a year you might consider to be a historical juncture. But 1994 is when the United States, with its NATO allies, and this is when I first arrived at the Joint Staff and its European NATO division, as you heard, where we had the first military exercise actually held with our former enemies. That is, those countries that used to oppose NATO in the Cold War. But they were countries emerging independently and had sovereignty over their, not only their country, but of course their foreign and defense policy, and they wanted to reintegrate into Europe. So on Polish territory in September 1994, we held an exercise under what would emerge as NATO's Partnership for Peace process, and I worked on the Partnership for Peace process during my years in government up till 2000 when I transitioned, and my New England-born, Massachusetts-born wife said, "Enough of Washington, I want to go home." And our first son was already upon the scene, and I realized it was time. We were down in Washington for almost 13 years. But we brought together on Polish territory a number of countries who couldn't even afford to airlift their equipment to Poland from around Europe. And so the U.S. taxpayers paid through an official program that was in the U.S. government and Defense Department's budget. I was put in charge of that budget in the Joint Staff. And what was so remarkable was that German military forces deployed for the first time since World War II on Polish territory cooperatively. I mean, think about that. To me, and I've written and published about this, that was a monumental moment. To exercise over 3 weeks in terms of peacekeeping and search and rescue missions, some humanitarian relief type operations with about 10 other countries, which included Ukrainian military. The Russians were invited. They didn't send a platoon because that was the level of the exercise, but they did send their military intelligence representatives to take stock, and that was fine. We knew this, and this is how it goes. Fast forward to 2014. You know that's when Russia partially invaded Ukraine, especially in Crimea and some of the eastern parts of the country, which still, to a great extent, are under their geographical and political control, as well as militarily. And then 2022 is the full-scale invasion. So I just highlight these timeframes for you to show where we are today. Because today, we are really, I would argue, at the realization that Poland and Ukraine have moved from a partnership, and let's be clear, since 1991 to the present, the Poles and the Ukrainians have cooperated in many ways. They've tried to overcome a very difficult history that goes back centuries and territories that change consistently, but their militaries have cooperated quite constructively, quite quietly for over 30 years. And not only are they integrating in terms of their militaries, but this is an alliance. And there are no doubts about this. When you're in an alliance, you will do whatever you can that is feasible, and we can talk about this, to protect one another. What you see here is a picture from a couple of, really just several weeks ago, of the Polish Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President in Kyiv, where the Polish Prime Minister basically committed the next phase of not only defense cooperation, but things like not only learning from Ukrainian battlefield lessons, but joint production of drones. And these are really significant ways for these countries not only to try to prosper, including having Polish natural gas piped into frozen Ukrainian homes that we're witnessing over these last weeks, but also ways for rebuilding Ukraine should that possibility arise. Reconsiderations, and I want to come back to what happens as I move toward the latter part of my presentation. What happens with the guarantees of security? You can have these partnerships, even these alliances. The United States always plays a key role over the last 80 years in European security, but we know things are changing rapidly, especially over the last year. You see in the top left corner, this is a picture of the leaders from the countries considered part of the coalition of the willing. So this includes primarily most of the European countries. Pictured, of course, are the Ukrainian and Polish leaders, but you also have the leaders of NATO and the European Union. And this is a coalition, at least in principle, that's been emerging over the last several months for how to wind down the war in Ukraine, and then what to do, not only about reconstruction, but also guaranteeing security. And this is very challenging when you consider that the territory of Ukraine is still up in the air as to what defines it. And how will the Russians and the Ukrainians actually find common ground? I want to spend the last part of this presentation walking you through how Poland not only reinforces NATO and the European Union, but bridges to Europe through Ukraine the very essence of how Ukraine, in many ways, not only survives today, but also advances today, even under some of the most difficult circumstances on the battlefield. What you have, not only are U.S. forces in Europe, as I've mentioned, but think about this. Elements of the 5th Corps headquarters, which is in many ways, is out of Fort Knox in Kentucky, but this harkens to World War II in many ways. But part of that headquarters moved to Poland as the full-scale invasion in the early months of 2022 started. So that's a very significant move by the U.S., and they've kept it there. And I haven't heard about them leaving, as well as air defense systems to augment and reinforce Poland, but in some ways to try to put the underpinning together with Ukraine. In the early weeks and months after February 24th, 2022, Poland raced its military equipment and to some extent its personnel quietly, but mostly its equipment into Ukraine, because it realized after those first 2 to 3 days that the Ukrainians would survive. And so they literally started emptying their stocks of military equipment into Ukraine. And this story has been told to some extent, but not nearly enough. So that today you find that, and I'm just going to give you, in effect, a list here, and I'll just read it because it is small text. Mobile anti-aircraft and long-range missile systems, self-propelled howitzers and mortars, Leopard T-72 and PT-91 tanks and armored vehicles. Some of those aren't even Polish. They're German, even Soviet-made, but they just moved them east, which was crucial, even though the Ukrainians, who are masters technologically, and we've seen this, especially in their drone warfare and anti-drone warfare, they're literally using military equipment from over 30 different countries, not all of which can interoperate. It's really quite remarkable. They're doing whatever they can. And of course you hear, because it captures the headlines more, MiG-29 fighter aircraft and Mi-24 helicopters, and the infantry, vehicles, the transporters, the self-propelled multiple rocket launchers and grenade launchers. I give you this list just to give you a sense of what has been done. Over the last 20 years, what's also happened is that on Polish territory, NATO's established what is the longest standing, let's see if I can get my pointer here. Seems to, there it is. The longest established standing unit in Central and Eastern Europe. It's called the Joint Force Support Center, and this is vital to integrating NATO nations into a command and control structure, especially when you look at one of the new members of NATO, Finland, which has nearly 1,000-mile border on Russia, Germany, and down here, Turkey. If you look at that arc, it certainly encompasses the battlefield that we see seemingly unending in Ukraine, but it also has that integrated NATO command structure, so important because there's never been an alliance in history that's had an integrated military command structure where planners and operators learn over lifetimes how to work together, even when they can't always communicate in the same language, although English still works pretty well in NATO. As I've been mentioning, advancing and manufacturing cutting-edge drones. And the Poles have, I think, recognized that the Ukrainians are the kings in this and are working together as fast as they can to reinforce each other's drone manufacturing capabilities. You also have the means for how this equipment and personnel actually get from Poland and from around the world through Poland. About 80% of Ukraine's reinforcement militarily comes through Poland, and it used to be a U.S. reinforced Polish corridor, but the U.S. has moved its forces a bit westward, and it's now transitioned to a Poland-NATO corridor at the, and some of you may have visited this area, Jasionka, the airport area, and its eastern region. This is an air, rail, and road transport hub, and I think it's indispensable to border resupply routes as well as reinforcement of countries. And this may sound very heavy in terms of a presentation, but if you really want to know the nuts and bolts for how Ukraine's surviving and how Poland and Ukraine are working together to do it on behalf of NATO and the other countries contributing whatever they can, this remains the key, I think. And in the process, Poland's air defense system not only integrates Europe and NATO in terms of air and missile defense, but Poland is building what it calls its East Shield, and NATO has activated, especially since Russia's drone strikes in September of last year onto Polish territory, Operation Eastern Sentry, where you have the real reinforcement of borders that go well beyond what we typically think when you're trying to stop militaries, at least on a battlefield. But this includes air defense and drone defense and counter defenses. It's well underway, and this is being done to a certain extent with the Ukrainians, while they not only fight a war, but also manufacture drones in factories that are getting hit by Russian missiles. It's really a remarkable display of survivability in this day and age. Poland likes to pride itself on being the highest percentage of gross domestic product in terms of military spending in NATO. So it's at the highest out of any NATO member, which includes the United States. You get into the percentages of these things, and it gets a bit complicated. But this is important, especially for crisis coordination and the command structure, and how Poland and Ukraine and their security arrangement and the defended Polish-Ukrainian border get us to this final piece here, and I'm going to close with this. You have a picture on the screen of the key players. Of course, this includes the United States, but when you're looking at Europe, you're looking at the British Prime Minister, the Ukrainian President, the French President, the German Chancellor, and the Polish Prime Minister. And if we're going to talk about anything in terms of negotiations and ceasefires, this reassurance force or coalition of the willing force that could go in there and backstop Ukraine, what Ukrainian territory could actually be defined as Ukrainian in some type of peace accord, should that happen. And then you look at how Ukraine integrates into Europe, even during wartime, into the European Union. What is Ukraine's NATO reality? Some of us think Ukraine should have been integrated into NATO a long time ago, but that's a great debate. But maybe I'm too old school for things like that. And you get back to the geostrategic pivot, which is that Mackinder thesis, and this backbone of these two countries that may give us some hope for some type of peaceful, shall we say, path in the years ahead. So I'll end with that. Thank you. So I'll focus on how can the Europeans, the Poles and the Germans, as you said, ensure some type of security guarantee for the Ukrainians, given how the Ukrainians have been, shall we say, shunted to the side. I would argue that you have all the makings of that in these boxes. I mean, militarily, those are the ways to have security guarantees if you're a military planner and you take the extraordinary lessons learned from those who fought, and then those who often, I hope, transition to the planning staffs. The question is, of course, political. Who do you invite into your organizations, your international institutions? I think what may be ironic is that in the challenges of NATO and its survival, given the issues being raised about NATO's future and the United States' role in NATO, and the push to have European countries do much more, and that's beyond military budgets. They actually do a lot on the ground and in these headquarters staffs, and then how they tie their militaries together. But this is decades in the making. So I guess I feel pretty confident that Germans, Poles, French, British, Finns, Swedes, Romanians, Italians, I mean, I could go down the list of NATO members, not only who have commands, integrated military commands on their territories, most of those, but it's fascinating. Just within the last week in the Netherlands at Brunsum, there's a German commander who oversees that joint command, and they've just given a poll from Poland, Polish military, for the first time in NATO history, they're going to have a rotational command in the Netherlands. This is a big deal because this is also a move where the United States might be reducing some of its command leadership there, which may be the reality, and the Europeans step forward. Now, how do you guarantee Ukraine's security? This is where that coalition of the willing process, which right now is, shall we say, pre-institutionalizing. This is not an organization just yet, but it's also a way that you dedicate resources, personnel, and lessons into a system, because that's what NATO is. It's a process, and it's a way that planners and operators, on behalf of their countries, in an integrated international alliance, work together and can deploy, as some of you know, to other parts of the world and operate quite effectively, or at least the underpinnings are there. But I don't know. I worry, like your question raised, which territory is Ukrainian? I'll just tell you that not too long after the 2014 Russian invasion against Ukraine, I wrote a piece actually that was published in a kind of a Mount Holyoke-based online blog, if you will. I don't know if John Western, has lectured here before. I'm not sure if he's still at Mount Holyoke, but I wrote a piece that ended with Central Western Ukraine, and this is 2014, could become the new Ukraine and integrate into international institutions like NATO. And the reason that 2014 invasion occurred primarily was because the Ukrainians wanted to get closer to the European Union. This didn't have to do with NATO. So we'll see. That's still kind of where I think the reality's heading, if there's any kind of negotiated settlement. But they've got to be reinforced on the ground and in the air, and even across any sea-based areas militarily. They've got to have the beginnings of that if they're going to have a real security guarantee, which means foreign forces on Ukrainian territory at their invitation out of Kyiv. I don't think that's a hardline position. I think given all the bloodshed, that's pretty practical. And that's what the Ukrainians have been asking for years. The question focused, and it was 1994, so you were right there. It was called the Budapest, as in Hungary, Memorandum. This was a memorandum which was seen as an agreement that the United States, Russia, Great Britain worked with Ukraine to denuclearize Ukraine. And that was the gist of your question, but it evaporated, and what to do when these pieces of paper evaporate, because this part of the world, Central and Eastern Europe, has been under the burden of pieces of paper that don't measure up over the last, let's say, century and before. It evaporated with that 2014 invasion. And you could start to see the makings of this even before 2014. That security guarantee on paper seemed very general. There weren't any forces designated to support Ukraine. There was cooperation that started to unfold, as I mentioned, with NATO nations in the Partnership for Peace process around the same time. And Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, although those, to be fair, were Soviet nuclear weapons, primarily controlled by Russians in Soviet, nuclear facilities over the decades of the Cold War. That said, though, when in rare instances a country gives up nuclear weapons voluntarily, typically, sadly, bad things happen. I think what you're seeing is, in terms of a piece of paper, how difficult it is today to get something on paper when you have negotiators who want to put uh, shall we say, the positions forward that are concrete, practical, and realistic. I would say that's the Ukrainian side. And the Russians, uh, and I just want to preface that I was an exchange student in 1985 in the USSR learning Russian. So I have Russian blood as well. So I think I understand the Ruskies pretty well. I know many. But when you look at their negotiating positions on ending this war, these are non-starters if you're a negotiator. But the only way to get to a concrete security guarantee is integrated military command structures. And ironically, once again, that's what's developing here in these boxes. It's in place. If there are political decisions, which we might not see for the foreseeable future, the real question, I think, becomes, building off your good points, that are we going to define a new type of, shall we say, status for the way Ukraine defines its territory in European security structures, not only like NATO, but the European Union? And it may not be membership, but maybe it's a new status. Operationally, militarily, that's in place in many ways. You could ask most military planners, they've done a lot in 30, 35 years together. The European Union has just started discussing over the last couple of days integrating Ukraine into the European Union partially, even before the final agreements are signed. And for European Union membership, that takes years and thousands of pages of documents, well beyond the piece of paper that was the Budapest Memorandum of '94. I'm optimistic the Europeans really get it now, especially since President Trump's sweep into office again, and the writings on the wall for how the Europeans have to move forward quite rapidly in new ways, as well as build off of their successes and understand the ways that things didn't go so well. They've got to reorient. So my view on the fairly new Polish president, Nawrocki, Karol Nawrocki, who's in an opposition party to the Polish prime minister, who we know, Donald Tusk. On Ukraine, I think, like with Russia, they agree. They have a lot of disputes on certainly domestic issues. These two political parties are at each other's throats for years. I've been going to Poland since 1990, and it never ceases to amaze, as you can appreciate, that like in other Central East European countries, with 2 or 3 polls, you've got about 5 or 6 opinions. So, and I think that's a compliment in many ways. I think on the issue of national security, even though there's a lot of debate over who's in charge of what parts of national security and foreign policy, and my old friend, I met him in 1989, Radek Sikorski, who's the current foreign minister. And he and his wife are friends of us, Ann Applebaum. Sikorski makes it pretty clear as foreign minister what the stand should be toward Ukraine and Russia, and Nawrocki and his fairly new staff are in sync on maintaining, let alone expanding, what you see on the screen. They understand. I think the two political parties agree on Russia. and the threat that it's always posed for the last 1,000 years or so, but especially over the last 11 years. So I think my time is up. Thank you.
So thank you so much. We have a little gift for you. Inside the Reagan White House by Frank Lavin, who was one of our speakers in the fall. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. As Steve Spellman said, there are flyers on the table for the Pros and Cons book group. I encourage anybody who's interested in nonfiction and interested in books to come to that. Again, you can talk to Bunsey or me about it if you have any more questions. There are membership flyers. There are also some flyers from the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia travel program. This one is a sort of a general one, but there are some specific to particular trips coming up. I don't know if Patty is a veteran of these trips and can tell you all about them, a big fan of them. If you are able to stick around, I would encourage you to stay and look at the photo exhibit we are fortunate enough to have here. If you have any questions, Olin and Christopher, who are the executive director and curator from the Polish Center, will be here to answer questions. And thank you all. Bye-bye.